A white officer's arrogance leads to an unforgettable lesson when he humiliates a black man, not knowing he's the new police chief. What starts as a day of unchecked authority is moments away from a shocking revelation that will change everything. The precinct stood at the heart of a small southern town, its brick walls weathered by decades of routine and tradition. The sign above the door read Meadowbrook Police Department, but the locals knew it by another name, the Good Old Boys Club. Inside those walls, whispers of misconduct and bias had circulated for years, quietly festering under the guise of order and protection. The town itself was a snapshot of racial tension. Streets were divided, not officially but visibly, with one side bustling with life and diversity, while the other seemed frozen in time. Meadowbrook was a place where reputations traveled faster than the evening news, and respect was handed out sparingly to those who didn't fit the mold. Within the department, complacency thrived. Officers leaned back in their chairs, feet propped on desks, laughing over their latest so-called jokes. The scent of stale coffee clung to the air, mingling with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. There was no rush to serve, no urgency to protect. The culture was clear: cover for your own, no matter what. And if someone didn't fit in, they were quickly reminded of their place. And Mill learned from Robinson. Marcus Allen stepped out of his car and surveyed the building with a measured gaze. A light breeze carried the faint smell of fried food from a nearby diner, but it did little to ease the tightness in his chest. He had read the reports, heard the rumors, and now, as the newly appointed chief of police, it was his responsibility to uncover the truth. Marcus wasn't here to make friends or play nice. He had spent 2 decades in law enforcement, rising through the ranks with a reputation for integrity and accountability. But none of that mattered here, not in a town like Meadowbrook. As a black man stepping into this role, he knew he'd face resistance at every turn. That was exactly why he had to do this his way. He adjusted his baseball cap, deliberately choosing to blend in. His plaid shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers gave no hint of authority, and that was the point. Marcus wasn't interested in choreographed introductions or staged handshakes. He wanted to see the precinct for what it truly was: raw and unfiltered. "The man arrested in Andyke," said. The parking lot buzzed with activity as officers came and went, some exchanging casual nods while others stood in small groups, sharing stories laced with laughter. Marcus observed quietly, noting the body language, the subtle glances, and the unspoken hierarchies. No one gave him a second look. Just another face in the crowd, Marcus thought, as he adjusted his posture and walked toward the building. Inside, the precinct was a mix of chaos and routine. Phones rang, papers shuffled, and conversations overlapped in a steady hum. Marcus walked slowly, taking it all in. The cracks in the walls, the coffee stains on desks, the officers who looked right through him. No one knew who he was. That was his advantage. It's humdrum. As he made his way past a cluster of officers, the faint echoes of laughter caught his ear. He paused, scanning the room. This was exactly what he needed: a glimpse into the culture he was about to dismantle. Marcus squared his shoulders and took a step forward. The real work was just beginning. He laughed at himself silently as he walked by, as he made his way past the metal detector, as he made his way past the cluster of officers, as he made his way past. It was as amoeba as it was a Colombian obscurity. Marcus squared his shoulders and took a deep. Marcus adjusted his baseball hat as he stepped onto the cracked asphalt of the precinct parking lot. The late morning sun cast long shadows, and the faint buzz of cicadas filled the air. He moved with purpose, but kept his head low, his plain clothes blending into the scene around him. Clusters of officers loitered near their cars, swapping stories with exaggerated gestures and bursts of laughter. A few leaned lazily against their vehicles, sipping from coffee cups and scrolling through their phones. Marcus slowed his pace, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. It didn't take long for the cracks in their camaraderie to show. Typical, Marcus thought as he spotted two officers exchanging a sly grin after passing a black teenager riding his bike. One of them muttered something under his breath and they both chuckled. The teenager pedaled faster, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Further down the lot, another officer gave a condescending wave to a Latina woman struggling to carry groceries to her car. She hesitated, smiled faintly, and kept walking, her pace hurried. The officer's smirk lingered long after she disappeared. Marcus clenched his jaw, his steps steady as he approached the building. Every move, every word he observed was a piece of the puzzle, a picture of a department where entitlement and bias had taken root. So, you. A sharp voice cut through the humid air, stopping Marcus in his tracks. He turned slowly, his face calm, as a tall white officer strode toward him. The man's smirk was unmistakable, his badge glinting in the sunlight. "Lost, are we?" the officer asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Marcus said nothing, his expression unreadable. "I said," the man continued louder now, "you lost or something? This ain't a shelter." The laughter that followed was harsh and mean-spirited. Behind the officer, his name tag read Daniels, a small group of other officers had paused their conversations to watch. One of them leaned against a patrol car, arms crossed, a smug grin spreading across his face. Marcus took a step forward, his hands relaxed at his sides. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he replied evenly. Daniels tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Oh, really? Because from where I'm standing, you look a little out of place." He motioned to Marcus's clothes with a flourish, drawing more laughter from the onlookers. Marcus met Daniels's gaze, his calm demeanor unwavering. "And from where I'm standing, it looks like you're wasting taxpayer dollars." Perling was surprised to see Chris laugh. Actually, the group fell silent for a beat, their laughter replaced by uneasy glances. But Daniels didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a sneer. "Listen, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to take that attitude and that mess you're wearing somewhere else." The words hung in the air, laced with venom. Marcus stayed rooted, his pulse steady despite the growing tension. "Did you hear me?" Daniels barked, his voice louder now, meant for the audience behind him. "Get out of here before I have you removed." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his silence speaking volumes. His calm seemed to irritate Daniels even more. "What's up with you?" Daniels yelled and then closed in around the fat man, speaking to him softly. Then Daniels leaned in, his face just inches from Marcus's. "You don't belong here," he hissed. The officers behind Daniels erupted into laughter again, slapping each other on the back. One of them muttered, "Yeah, show 'em who's boss." Marcus stayed still, his heart pounding, but his face betraying nothing. He glanced at Daniels, then at the group behind him. He wasn't surprised. This was exactly what he had come to see. Suddenly, as with all the Christie summits, the feelings of hope and excitement. "Have a good day, officer," Marcus said finally, his tone calm and steady. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the precinct doors. The sound of laughter followed him, but he didn't look back. Marcus's hand tightened into a fist as he reached for the handle. In a distant voice, he muttered, "Check that tie," before turning and walking toward the main hall. The real test was yet to come. Marcus stepped into the hallway, his footsteps steady, the faint hum of ringing phones and muffled conversations surrounding him. He moved deliberately, taking in every corner, every face. But he didn't get far. "Hold right there." The voice was loud, sharp, and unmistakably Daniels. Marcus stopped, turning slowly. The officer stalked toward him, his smug grin back in full force. "Didn't I tell you to get out?" Daniels's tone was mocking, each word dripping with condescension. "What part of that didn't you understand?" "1 second, the next." Marcus said nothing, his calm demeanor masking the simmering tension beneath the surface. He wasn't here to argue. Not yet. Daniel stopped just inches from Marcus, his towering frame meant to intimidate. Behind him, the other officers had gathered, their amused smirks and low chuckles filling the space. Uh, Up within I don't know what makes you think you belong here, Daniel sneered, glancing at Marcus's worn jeans and sneakers. But this isn't some charity. You're way out of your league. Marcus met Daniels's gaze, steady and unflinching. He didn't say a word, his gaze silent. The silence seemed to irritate Daniels. He leaned closer, his grin fading into something colder, sharper. What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? One of the officers behind Daniels snickered. Another muttered something about showing the guy his place. Marcus caught the words, but didn't react. The bandage on Marcus's left cheek, but did not react to Marcus's words. You think you're tough, huh? Daniels said, his voice rising. Walking in here like you own the place? Newsflash, you don't. People like you, he paused, letting the words hang in the air for effect, don't belong here. The laughter behind him grew louder. One officer slapped the desk, doubling over in amusement. Another leaned against the wall, watching with a faint smirk but shifting uneasily. Anything I have is private, Bam said, sinking to the floor. Marcus's jaw tightened, but his face remained calm. He'd seen this behavior before. Bullies always relied on an audience. Daniels took another step forward, his face inches from Marcus's. And then it happened. Without warning, Daniels spit directly into Marcus's face. Time seemed to freeze. The warm saliva trickled down Marcus's cheek, the humiliation stinging far worse than the act itself. Around him, the laughter erupted into full-blown roars. One officer clapped, another whistled, while the rest watched in twisted amusement. Yeah, that's right, Daniel said, his voice triumphant. Now you know exactly where you stand. Rachel gestured for them to sit. Marcus's heart pounded, but he didn't flinch. He raised a hand slowly, pulling a neatly folded handkerchief from his pocket. The movement was deliberate, almost calculated. He wiped his face in silence, each stroke measured, his eyes locked on Daniel's the entire time. The laughter continued, but it grew quieter, some of the onlookers shifting uncomfortably under the weight of Marcus's calmness. This is, When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was steady, even. Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors, officer? I'm... Daniel smirked, shrugging. Just the ones who don't belong. The response drew another round of chuckles, though weaker this time. Marcus could see the unease growing in a few faces, but no one spoke up. No one stopped it. Marcus folded the handkerchief carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate. He glanced briefly at the group, letting his gaze linger just long enough to remind them he saw everything. Then without another word, he turned and walked away. The hallway seemed longer now, every step echoing louder than the last. Behind him, the laughter resumed, though it lacked the same confidence. Marcus didn't look back. He kept his composure, even as his pulse raced and his fists clenched at his sides. He could still hear Daniel's voice, louder than the rest. Good riddance. Marcus reached the door to the main office and paused, his hand on the handle. He drew a deep breath, exhaling slowly. This was exactly why he had come here. To see the department's culture laid bare. And now he had seen enough. The faint echo of laughter faded as the door clicked shut behind him. Marcus straightened his shoulders, his face calm but his resolve burning stronger than ever. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The crackle of the intercom broke through the chatter in the precinct. Oh, officers to the briefing room. Meeting starts in 5 minutes, the voice announced. Daniels leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a smirk still plastered on his face. He was clearly enjoying the memory of his earlier confrontation with Marcus. "Did you see that guy's face?" he said, chuckling. "Thought he'd just stroll in here like he belonged." One of the officers laughed, shaking his head. "You really showed him, Daniels." The group laughed louder, their casual banter filling the hallway. Other officers passed by, some grinning, others looking away. No one dared to challenge Daniels. It's bah. Inside the briefing room, the mood was light. Officers joked about the morning, sipping coffee and leaning back in their chairs. Daniels sat near the back, his legs stretched out, still riding the high of his earlier victory. The room quieted slightly as Captain Harris walked to the front, carrying a stack of papers. He placed them on the podium and cleared his throat. "Settle down, everyone," Harris said, his voice firm but calm. "We have an important introduction today." A low murmur rippled through the room. Most of the officers knew this meeting was about the new chief, but they didn't seem overly concerned. Daniels exchanged a glance with another officer, smirking. "Haha, new boss, same old nonsense," Daniels whispered. The side door to the room opened with a quiet creak. The sound barely registered at first, but then a figure stepped inside. A hand, and he didn't stop talking. "Marquez." This time he wasn't wearing plain clothes. He was dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, a neatly knotted tie, and polished shoes. He held a folder embossed with the department's official seal. His posture was confident, his expression calm. Ah. The room froze. All eyes turned to him as he walked slowly to the front. The steady click of his shoes against the floor was the only sound in the room. Marcus stopped beside Captain Harris, placing the folder on the podium with deliberate precision. Captain Harris." He signed and pointed at him. Daniel sat up straighter, his smirk faltering. His eyes widened as realization began to sink in. Harris glanced at Marcus, then turned to the room. "As many of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. Today, I am pleased to introduce his replacement. This man comes to us with an impressive record and a clear vision for this department." Harris gestured toward Marcus. "Everyone, meet Marcus Allen, your new chief of police." The silence was deafening. Marcus scanned the room, his eyes calm but piercing. He took in every face, every expression. Some officers exchanged nervous glances, a few whispered quietly, but most just stared, frozen in shock. Daniels' face turned pale. The confidence he'd displayed all morning was gone. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice steady and firm. "As Captain Harris mentioned, I'm Marcus Allen, your new chief of police." He paused, letting his words settle. His gaze swept across the room again, lingering briefly on Daniels. "When I arrived this morning," Marcus continued, "I chose to come in plain clothes. I wanted to see the department as it truly is, not through the filter of formal introductions or rehearsed welcomes. But, yeah, um, the room remained silent. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "What I saw," Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly, "was eye-opening." Daniel swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. He avoided Marcus's gaze, his eyes fixed on the floor. "In my short time here," Marcus said, "I've already witnessed behaviors that are not only unprofessional, but completely unacceptable." A faint murmur rippled through the crowd, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing it. "Respect," he said, his tone sharp, "is not optional. It is the foundation of everything we do as law enforcement officers. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we serve." Oh! Marcus took a step closer to the edge of the podium. His presence was commanding, his voice unwavering. "This morning," he continued, "some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place." Yeah, so people thought. Daniels' knuckles turned white as he gripped his chair tighter. "But let me remind you," Marcus said, his gaze locking on Daniels, "every person who walks through those doors deserves respect, whether they wear a badge or not." The room was so quiet it felt as though the air had been sucked out. Marcus held the silence, letting his words sink in. Daniels finally looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. "This is just the beginning," Marcus said firmly. "I expect every one of you to rise to the standard this department should uphold. If you can't, this isn't the place for you." With that, Marcus stepped back, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room was thick, the weight of his words hanging heavy. Daniel slumped back in his chair, his earlier confidence shattered. Around him, the other officers exchanged uneasy glances, their casual chatter from earlier, now a distant memory. End of chapter. The revelation had shaken them all. Marcus stood at the podium, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The silence was thick, the tension almost visible in the air. Every officer in the room sat stiffly, their attention locked on him. "I'll keep this simple," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "This morning, I had the chance to observe this department without anyone knowing who I was. What I saw was concerning." A murmur rippled through the room. Marcus raised his hand, and the noise stopped. "I'm not here to point fingers," he continued, his gaze steady, "but I am here to address the truth. This department has a problem, a big one, and it's time we face it. Conference is getting that way." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead. He kept his eyes down, avoiding Marcus's penetrating stare. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his tone sharpening. "Respect. It's a simple word, but it carries so much weight. Respect isn't just something we give to people we like. It's something we owe to every person who walks through our doors, our colleagues, the people we serve, everyone." His words hung in the air for a moment. He stepped back slightly, his voice softening but still firm. "Today, I saw what happens when respect is absent. I saw behavior that was unprofessional, unacceptable, and frankly, embarrassing. And I asked to leave." And a few officers glanced nervously at each other. Others sat frozen, their faces blank, but their discomfort evident. Marcus continued, his tone measured. "Let me be clear. This stops now. The toxic culture, the disrespect, the lack of accountability, it all ends today. And stop down." And Daniels wiped his brow, his earlier smugness completely gone. He looked smaller now. Hunched in his chair, his confidence evaporated. "I know change isn't easy," Marcus said, his voice softening slightly. "I know some of you might feel defensive right now, but this isn't about punishing anyone. This is about raising the standard. Because if we don't hold ourselves accountable, how can we expect the community to trust us?" He paused, letting his words sink in. The officer sat in silence, the weight of his speech pressing down on them. "We wear this badge," Marcus said, lifting his hand to point at the emblem on his chest. "Not for power, not for authority, but for responsibility. Responsibility to protect, to serve, and to lead with integrity." He stepped away from the podium and began walking slowly across the front of the room. His presence was commanding, his every step purposeful. "This morning," Marcus said, his voice rising slightly, "some of you thought it was funny to mock someone you didn't know, to humiliate them, to make them feel like they didn't belong." Daniels flinched, his jaw tightening. "And that kind of behavior doesn't just hurt the person on the receiving end," Marcus continued. "It hurts all of us. It damages the reputation of this department and it erodes the trust we're supposed to build with the community." He paused for a moment, listening, and then replied, "You know what? I realize that I actually do forget about your phone every time I'm working on a lot together. It's probably the best way." He stopped in the center of the room, turning to face the officers directly. "If you think this kind of behavior is acceptable, let me tell you now, it's not," Marcus said firmly. "And if you think you can continue acting this way without consequences, you're wrong." The room was silent. Daniel shifted again, his discomfort obvious. I will not tolerate disrespect, Marcus said, his tone final. I will not tolerate bullying, and I will not tolerate anyone who thinks they're above the values this badge represents. I was about to say thank you so much. Marcus took a deep breath, his expression softening slightly. I'm not here to make enemies, he said. I'm here to make this department better, but I can't do it alone. I need each of you to look at yourselves, to ask if you're part of the problem or part of the solution. Are you angry at me for saying no to contests all the time? His gaze swept the room, locking on each officer for a moment before moving to the next. Change starts here, Marcus said. It starts with each of us holding ourselves accountable. It starts with us leading by example. He stepped back toward the podium, his final words calm but powerful. If you're ready to do better to be better, then we'll move forward together. But if you're not willing to change, this isn't the place for you. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Daniel stared at the floor, his face flushed, sweat dripping down his temple. Around him, officers exchanged uneasy glances. Some sat in quiet reflection. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Marcus gave a slight nod, his calm expression unchanged. Thank you, he said simply, stepping away from the podium. The meeting was over, but the impact of his words had only just begun. The room sat in heavy silence, Marcus's words still echoing. No one dared to speak. Officers shifted in their chairs, the earlier camaraderie now replaced with unease. Marcus stepped forward again, his calm demeanor unchanged, but his tone carried a sharp edge. Before we move forward, there is one matter I need to address immediately. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. Daniels, seated near the back, straightened up, his jaw tightening. He nodded. This morning, Marcus said, his gaze sweeping the room, I witnessed conduct that was unacceptable on every level. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was disgraceful. Daniel stiffened. His smirk was long gone, replaced by a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. Marcus paused, his eyes locking on Daniel's for a moment. He didn't need to name him. Everyone knew who he was talking about. Effective immediately, Marcus announced, his voice calm but firm. Officer Daniels is suspended pending an internal investigation. Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel shot to his feet, his face red with anger and disbelief. You can't be serious, he blurted, his voice cracking. Marcus turned to him, his expression unyielding. I am. Your actions this morning violated every standard this department is supposed to uphold. I like to think. Daniels' fists clenched at his sides. You don't even know me, he shouted. You think you can just walk in here and... I know enough, Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through Daniels' protests. I know what I saw, and I know it won't happen again. Not here. Daniels froze, his mouth opening as if to argue, but no words came. The weight of Marcus's authority left him no room to fight back. Marcus turned his attention back to the room. This isn't just about one person, he said, his tone steady. This is about all of us. This department cannot function if we don't hold ourselves accountable. And yeah, I get the complaint there, but also I am not asking people to group themselves. The other officers exchanged nervous glances. Some nodded slightly, while others avoided eye contact altogether. To prevent this from happening again, Marcus continued, we are implementing new policies immediately. Every officer will undergo mandatory bias training. Professional conduct standards will be enforced at all levels. And from now on, every complaint of misconduct will be taken seriously. The room remained silent, but the tension was palpable. Marcus's words weren't just changes, they were a challenge to everything the department had become. Products were not okay. Personalities, personal, not just physical. Daniels broke the silence, his voice low but bitter. You'll regret this, he muttered, glaring at Marcus. Marcus held his gaze, unflinching. "The only regret here," he said firmly, "is that it took this long for someone to take a stand." Daniels grabbed his belongings, his movements jerky and rushed. He stormed toward the door, slamming it open as he left. The sound echoed through the room. Yeah. All eyes followed him, but no one said a word. The officer sat frozen, the reality of the moment sinking in. Marcus let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. "This isn't about punishment," he said, his voice softening slightly. "This is about setting a standard of respect, integrity, and accountability." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room once more. "If we want the community to trust us, we have to earn it every single day." Some officers nodded again, their expressions serious. Others looked uncertain, but none dared to challenge him. "Change isn't easy," Marcus said, "but it's necessary. And it starts today." With that, he stepped back, signaling the end of the meeting. Slowly, the officers began to rise, their chatter muted and cautious. As they filed out, Marcus remained standing at the front of the room, his posture tall and unyielding. He watched as Daniels' absence left a void, a reminder of what was no longer acceptable. Cyrus, assisted by two women, opened the door behind me. The precinct had been shaken to its core, but for the first time, Marcus felt like it was moving in the right direction, and watching Kane's submission sped momentum toward his release. The next day, Marcus said to me at breakfast, "Get going." The days following Marcus's bold speech were quiet, almost unnaturally so. The precinct, once filled with chatter and laughter, now carried an air of caution. Officers moved carefully, their usual banter replaced with low murmurs. Marcus's words lingered in every corner of the building, impossible to ignore. Marcus wasn't just a name on a door, he was everywhere. He walked the halls daily, nodding to those who met his gaze, pausing to observe conversations and checking on paperwork. His presence was constant, a reminder that change wasn't just a speech, it was happening. He wore one of 4 kumaks somewhere next to his name, indicating that it was happening. He hardcore believed in ritual. Some officers adjusted quickly. They greeted Marcus respectfully, their behavior more thoughtful and professional. Others, however, resisted. Marcus could feel the tension when he walked into a room. Averted eyes, stiff postures, silent defiance. He expected it, but it didn't deter him. The quiet resolve somehow exonerated him. He nodded, trying not to show his worries. One afternoon, as Marcus reviewed case files in his office, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," he said, looking up. The door opened slowly and Officer Perez stepped inside. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, her uniform neat but her face uneasy. "Chief," she began, her voice hesitant, "do you have a minute?" Marcus set his pen down and gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course. Have a seat." Perez sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room before finally meeting Marcus's gaze. "I need to be honest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything." Marcus leaned back, giving her his full attention. "Go ahead." Perez took a deep breath. "I've been here for 2 years, and I've seen things. I've heard things. Stuff that isn't right. But I didn't say anything." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed on. "I didn't want to be the one to rock the boat. I was scared, and to be honest, I laughed along sometimes, just to fit in." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let her words settle, his calm expression encouraging her to continue. "But now," she said, her voice growing steadier, "I can't ignore it anymore. I don't want to be part of the problem. I want to do better, Chief." And that's amazing to see, her really stand up to people. Marcus nodded slowly. "It takes courage to admit that," he said. and it takes even more to change. The fact that you're here tells me you're ready to start. Perez nodded, a hint of relief crossing her face. I am. Whatever it takes, I'll do it. Marcus leaned forward, his tone firm but encouraging. It starts with accountability, Officer Perez, for yourself and for others. Change isn't easy, but it's worth it. If you're willing to put in the work, I'll support you every step of the way. Perez nodded again, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down. As Perez left, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't the first officer to approach him, and he knew she wouldn't be the last. Slowly but surely, cracks were forming in the old culture. But not everyone was willing to adapt. Some officers grumbled under their breath as Marcus passed, their resistance clear. A few made excuses to avoid his mandatory training sessions. And then there were the whispered complaints about the new rules, about how things were fine before. Marcus addressed each challenge with patience but firmness. This isn't about making things comfortable, he reminded them during one meeting. It's about making things right. Over time, his presence began to shift the atmosphere. Officers who once laughed at inappropriate jokes now stayed silent. Others started speaking up, challenging behavior they used to ignore. It was slow progress, but it was progress. Marcus didn't expect to win everyone over. He knew some would never change, and those who couldn't adapt would eventually find their way out. But for those who stayed, there was hope. Every conversation, every small victory was a step toward a better precinct. And Marcus knew that's where real change began. Not with sweeping gestures, but with consistent, everyday effort. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the community park. Families gathered near picnic tables. Children chased each other on the grass, and the aroma of grilled food filled the air. The event, hosted by the local community center, was meant to foster connection between the police and the residents. But the atmosphere was tense. Marcus stood near the edge of the gathering, observing the crowd. He could feel the skeptical eyes on him, the hushed whispers as he passed. People knew who he was, the new police chief. But in a town that had long felt neglected and mistreated by law enforcement, his presence wasn't enough to erase years of mistrust. Look at him, an older man muttered to his friend, another suit with promises he can't keep. A woman nearby folded her arms, her expression guarded. We've heard it all before, she said softly. Marcus nodded politely at those he passed, understanding their hesitation. Words alone wouldn't fix this. He had to earn their trust, and he knew that would take time. As he moved toward the main area, a small voice stopped him. Excuse me. Marcus turned to see a boy standing a few feet away. He couldn't have been older than 8. He wore a faded t-shirt and jeans, his hands stuffed nervously into his pockets. Yes, Marcus said gently, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. The boy hesitated, glancing at the ground before speaking. Are you really the chief? Marcus smiled. I am. My name's Marcus. What's yours? Jaden, the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. It's nice to meet you, Jaden, Marcus said warmly. What's on your mind? The boy bit his lip, then looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. My mom says the police don't care about people like us. Is that true? The question hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Around them, a few people turned to listen, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. Marcus took a deep breath. He didn't rush his response. He wanted Jaden and everyone watching to know he meant every word. I can't change what happened before I got here, Marcus said carefully, but I promise you this. I care, and I'm working hard to make sure this department cares too. Jaden tilted his head. Really? Really, Marcus said firmly. You deserve to feel safe, you deserve respect, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you get both. The boy's face softened, a small smile breaking through his nervousness. Okay, he said quietly. Marcus reached out and gently patted Jaden's shoulder. And if you ever need help, you can come find me. Deal? Deal, Jaden said, his smile growing. The interaction seemed to shift something in the air. People nearby murmured softly, their expressions less guarded. A woman stepped forward, her voice hesitant but sincere. She began, but was held back by colors all around her. We'll be watching, Chief, she said. We want to believe you, but we've been let down before. Marcus nodded. I understand. Hold me accountable. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to make a difference. The crowd slowly began to warm, though the skepticism didn't disappear entirely. Marcus knew trust wouldn't come overnight, but this moment felt like a small step forward. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Marcus stood among the community, listening to their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes. Each conversation reminded him why he had taken this job, to bridge the divide and show them that change was possible. During the day, he did a lot of good work, and plus, a year had passed and the precinct looked different, not just on the surface, but in the ways that mattered most. The halls, once filled with tension and unchecked arrogance, now buzzed with purpose. The cliques that had laughed at misconduct were gone, replaced by officers focused on doing the job right. The old culture, built on entitlement and silence, had started to crumble. Marcus stood at the entrance, watching as a group of fresh recruits walked in. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces determined. These were men and women who had joined the force knowing the high standards they'd be held to. Marcus greeted them with a nod, feeling a spark of hope as they passed. They marched back toward the media building, smiling almost cheerfully. A moment later, a group of weapons canvas stood on the ground. Inside, community outreach programs had taken root. Officers now spent time mentoring local kids, attending town hall meetings, and hosting safety workshops. These efforts weren't just about improving the precinct's image, they were about rebuilding trust, one step at a time. The changes weren't easy. The process had been slow and sometimes painful. A handful of toxic officers had refused to adapt, their resistance as loud as their misconduct had been. But Marcus had been firm. He didn't tolerate excuses, and he didn't hesitate to let them go. Accountability isn't optional, he had told the department early on, and he meant it. Now, the precinct was staffed with officers who believed in that vision. Some were veterans who had stepped up, eager to prove they could do better. Others were new recruits, untainted by the old ways. Together, they were shaping something new. In his office, Marcus sat at his desk, reviewing reports. The numbers reflected the changes. Complaints against officers had dropped. Community surveys showed rising levels of trust. It was progress. Slow, steady, and real. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Officer Perez stepped in, her smile genuine. Chief, she said, just wanted to let you know the youth mentoring program starts next week. We've got a great turnout already. I smiled. Marcus smiled. It's good to hear. Keep me updated. And before he allowed himself to get frustrated, his phone rang. He looked up to see that Ray's Allbands had arrived, giving him a call as well. As Perez left, Marcus leaned back in his chair. He thought about how far they'd come. The precinct was far from perfect, but it was undeniably better. Officers were learning to lead with respect. The community was beginning to see them as allies, not enemies. Still, Marcus knew the work wasn't over. Changing a culture wasn't a task you finished. It was something you maintained, day after day. He glanced out the window, watching as officers returned from their shifts. There was laughter in the hallway, but it was different now. It wasn't at someone's expense. It was genuine, built on camaraderie and mutual respect. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a deep sense of hope. Change was never easy, but as he looked at the precinct, he knew it had been worth every fight.